What happens when the man everyone laughed at, the one they called grease-stained, broke, nobody, turns out to be the one person keeping their entire world from collapsing? In a city built on old money and quiet power, a humble boat mechanic raising his little girl alone holds a secret that could shake Savannah to its core. And on the night the room full of billionaires finally looks his way, it won't be admiration they feel first. It'll be shame. Drop a like if you want to see how far this goes, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The morning Mason Drake burned his last tie started the same as every other. Salt air, diesel fuel, and his daughter asking him why the neighbor's cat always sat on their truck. "Because she knows you'll feed her," Mason said, without looking up from the engine block he was pulling apart on the dock. "She's strategic," Lily said, very seriously, like she'd been saving that word all week. "She is. Like a businesswoman." Mason finally looked up. Lily was 8 years old, standing in her school clothes with her hair half-braided because she'd let him try and then quietly fixed it herself when she thought he wasn't watching. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looked almost amber in morning light, and her mother's habit of saying things that landed a little harder than you expected. "Sure," Mason said. "Like a businesswoman." He went back to the engine. Lily fed the cat 3 pieces of the turkey she was supposed to be eating herself, and neither of them mentioned it. This was their life. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't glamorous. It was a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of the Savannah waterfront district, a truck with a busted passenger side speaker, a dock job that paid in cash 3 days a week, and in favors the other 2. It was Lily's drawings taped to the refrigerator and homework spread across the kitchen table every evening, while Mason ate whatever he'd made and told her about the boats he'd worked on, giving each one a name and a personality, so the stories were more interesting than they actually were. The Marlene was a 42-foot sloop with a stubborn rudder and a suspected drinking problem. The Admiral Fitch was a rusted commercial trawler whose owner cried every time he had to leave port and came back 2 days later having not caught a single thing. The Cecilia, and Mason always said this one quietly, was a restored 1960s wooden cabin cruiser that someone had painted pale blue and left at the marina after a divorce. And it was the most beautiful boat he'd ever worked on, and he hadn't been able to sell it even when he was supposed to. Lily knew all of them. She asked follow-up questions. She had opinions. This was their life, and Mason had chosen it deliberately, with both hands, the way you choose something you know will cost you something else entirely. What it had cost him was a corner office on the 43rd floor of a building in Lower Manhattan, a salary that would have made most people physically dizzy, and a version of himself he'd spent 3 years trying to figure out how to stop being. He'd been 26 when he started at Hargrove Capital, 29 when he made partner, 30 when his wife Claire told him she was pregnant, and he'd stood in their kitchen holding a positive test and felt, for the first time in years, like he was living inside something real. Claire had been a pediatric nurse. She worked long shifts and came home smelling like antiseptic and immediately wanted to talk about something unrelated to work. Anything, the weather or the restaurant they'd walked past, or the argument she'd overheard between 2 pigeons on the window ledge. She was the person in Mason's life who reminded him that the world was larger than quarterly projections and leverage ratios. She thought his job was interesting the way you think a different language is interesting. She respected it without wanting it for herself. They'd had 3 good years in that apartment. Then the pregnancy, which they hadn't planned but which settled into their lives like it had always been there. Then the complication at 32 weeks that the doctors caught but could not reverse. Then a delivery that went wrong in ways that Mason still couldn't fully articulate, even to himself. Claire didn't survive it. Lily did. And Mason sat in a hospital room holding a baby who weighed less than 5 pounds and understood, with absolute clarity, that every choice he made from this point forward was going to be in service of something that actually mattered. Not a fund, not a portfolio, not a number on a screen that changed every 11 seconds. He left Hargrove Capital 4 months later. His colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. His mentor, a 60-year-old man named Gerald, who had given up 2 marriages for the job, took him to lunch and spent 45 minutes explaining that grief was temporary and equity was not. Mason listened politely, paid the check, and submitted his resignation the same afternoon. He moved to Savannah because Claire had wanted to. She'd grown up visiting her grandmother there, and she'd always said they'd retire someday to somewhere with water and live oaks and streets that didn't smell like exhaust and urgency. It wasn't retirement, but it was close enough that it hurt in a way that also felt correct. He learned to work on boats because he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't numbers. He turned out to be good at it, not gifted, not inspired, but methodical and patient, and willing to take apart an engine 3 times until he understood exactly why it was doing what it was doing. Those were, it turned out, useful qualities in a mechanic. Less useful, apparently, in a person, but Mason was working on that. The dock job was real. The 2-bedroom rental was real. The truck with the busted speaker was real. The rest of it, the part nobody on the waterfront knew about, was also real. Just quieter. He still had access to the money. He'd liquidated most of his positions before leaving New York, invested conservatively, and generated returns that, compounding over 4 years, had grown into something substantial enough that Mason sometimes had to remind himself it wasn't abstract. It was real capital attached to his name, sitting in accounts that he never touched for himself. He didn't know exactly when the idea of the foundation had formed. It hadn't been a single moment. It had been more like a slow accretion. Reading about a shelter in Charleston that was closing for lack of funding, seeing a news segment about children aging out of foster care with no support system, thinking about Lily's face while she slept, and then thinking about children who didn't have what Lily had, which wasn't much, but was enough. The Drake Foundation didn't advertise. It didn't have a website. It had a lawyer in Atlanta named Martin Cho, who handled disbursements and kept meticulous records, and a protocol Mason had established from the start. The money went where it was needed. The name stayed off the documentation, and no one asked questions about the source. In 5 years, the foundation had distributed roughly $22 million to organizations working in child welfare, housing security, and women's emergency services across the Southeast. Mason tracked every dollar through Martin's monthly reports. He knew which shelters were expanding, which programs were struggling, which executive directors were doing the actual work versus the ones who were good at press releases. That was how he knew about the Sterling Foundation. Victoria Sterling's organization had come onto his radar 3 years earlier when Martin flagged it during one of their quarterly calls. "There's a nonprofit out of Savannah that I think warrants a closer look," Martin had said, with the careful neutrality he used when he was actually excited. Strong track record on children's services, transparent financials, at least the public ones, and a CEO who seems to be doing it for the right reasons. "What does the right reasons mean to you, Martin?" "She takes a salary below market rate, and she was photographed last spring painting walls at one of her own shelters." Mason had thought about that for a moment. "Okay," he said, "let's look." He'd done his own research before authorizing the first grant. Victoria Sterling had started her organization at 24 with seed money from a tech acquisition she'd made at 22. One of those stories that sounded improbable, but was, when you traced it back, simply the result of someone being very smart at exactly the right moment and then choosing to do something unusual with what that gave them. She hadn't gone back into tech. She hadn't bought a second home or a yacht or any of the other things people did when they landed money before they were 30. She'd incorporated a nonprofit and spent the next 6 years building it into one of the most effective children's welfare organizations in the region. She was, by most metrics, exactly what Mason's foundation was looking for. He'd authorized an initial grant of $400,000. Then another. Then, over 3 years, a cumulative transfer of just under $9 million, distributed across 14 of her organization's programs. Martin verified the fund usage quarterly. The numbers were consistently clean, until they weren't. Yashman. The discrepancy appeared in February, buried in a programmatic expenditure report for the 4th quarter. It wasn't large enough to be immediately obvious, but Mason almost missed it himself, and he'd been reading financial reports since he was 25. A variance of roughly $80,000 in a construction expenditure column attached to a shelter project in Brunswick that, according to the progress report, was 40% complete. Mason pulled up the prior quarter's report. The project had been listed at 40% complete in that one, too. He called Martin. "It might be a reporting lag," Martin said. "Construction schedules slip all the time." "Pull the vendor documentation." There was a pause. "Mason, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I just want to see the vendor documentation. Martin pulled it. The vendor, a company called Hearthstone Construction Partners, had issued 2 invoices for work on the Brunswick site, totaling $160,000. Martin ran a basic background check on the company and called Mason back within 48 hours. Hearthstone Construction Partners was incorporated 18 months ago, Martin said. It has no employees on record, no physical address, and no contractor's license in the state of Georgia. Mason sat with that for a long moment. Outside his workshop window, a pelican was standing on a dock piling, absolutely still, watching the water with an expression that suggested it had seen worse. How many projects have received payments from Sterling's construction account in the last 2 years? Mason asked. Martin took 3 days to compile the answer. When he called back, his voice was careful in the way it got when he was delivering information he wished he didn't have. 11 separate projects, Martin said. 7 vendors that don't appear to exist as functioning entities. Total expenditure across those accounts. And Mason, this is preliminary, this needs a full forensic review. Preliminary figure is somewhere between $8 and $14 million. Mason didn't say anything for a moment. She doesn't know, he said. You can't know that from these numbers. She doesn't know, he said again. It wasn't a defense of Victoria Sterling. It was a read of the financial pattern. The fraud was too well layered, too distributed, too carefully placed within the normal noise of organizational spending to be something a CEO would sign off on openly. Whoever was doing this knew exactly which numbers got scrutinized and which ones didn't. They'd been doing it long enough to be confident. We need to find the person with access to those construction accounts, Mason said. That's not something I can do from Atlanta, Martin said. That requires someone on the ground. Mason looked out the window again. The pelican was gone. I know, he said. Just sit. He heard about the gala from Lily. This was not how he'd planned it. His plan had been to identify the right contact within Victoria Sterling's organization, establish a quiet channel through Martin, and route the investigation through intermediaries who could be trusted. He was not supposed to be anywhere near the Sterling Foundation or its events. That had been a rule since the beginning. The anonymity wasn't just preference, it was protection. For the foundation, for the programs, for the integrity of the giving itself. But Lily had a classmate named Sophie whose mother worked in catering, and Sophie had told Lily that her mom was doing the food for a big gala at the DeSoto Hotel downtown, and that there was going to be ice sculpture, and Lily had come home and announced this at dinner as though it were simply the most interesting news of the day, and Mason had said, and gone back to his food. 3 days later, he'd found the event listing on a local society page and stood in his kitchen reading it for a long time. The Sterling Foundation Annual Gala, the DeSoto Hotel, Savannah. 7 p.m. Victoria Sterling, founder and CEO, would be in attendance, so would Damian Reeves, Executive Vice President of Finance. Mason recognized the name immediately. He'd pulled Reeves's professional history 2 days earlier as part of the internal research, 12 years in nonprofit financial management, a spotless public record, references from 3 respected organizations, and access to every major financial system at Sterling. He was the most likely architect of the fraud. He was also the person Victoria Sterling trusted most to run her organization's money. Mason had not been planning to attend. He spent an evening considering it. Then he called Martin. I'm going to go look, he said. That's an extremely vague statement that could mean several things, Martin said, and I'm not sure I endorse any of them. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to observe. You're going to attend a gala for a foundation you've been anonymously funding for 3 years in a city where you work as a boat mechanic without telling anyone who you are. Yes. A long pause. What are you going to wear? Mason thought about the gray suit in the back of his closet. He hadn't worn it in 4 years. He wasn't sure it still fit. I'll figure something out, he said. The DeSoto Hotel had been built in 1890 and renovated 4 times since, most recently by someone with a fondness for warm lighting and fresh flowers that cost more per arrangement than Mason made in a week at the dock. The main ballroom on the second floor was the kind of room designed to make the people inside it feel like the important work was already done. High ceilings, chandeliers, round tables dressed in white linen, a stage at the far end where the speeches would happen. Mason arrived at 7:40, which was deliberately late enough to avoid the reception line, but early enough to watch the room before the formal program began. He'd left Lily with Mrs. Tran from down the hall, who watched her 2 evenings a week in exchange for Mason repairing her nephew's outboard motor, an arrangement that suited everyone. Lily had made him promise to bring home one of the fancy desserts if there were any left over. He'd said he'd try. The suit fit. Barely. He accepted a glass of water from a passing tray and found a position near the back wall where he had a clear sightline to most of the room. He was looking for Damian Reeves. He'd memorized the headshot from the organization's staff page. And he was also, if he was being honest with himself, curious about Victoria Sterling in a way that had nothing to do with the investigation and which he was trying not to think about too carefully. He found Reeves first. Damian Reeves was 44, broad-shouldered, with silver-threaded hair and the particular confidence of a man who had been the most competent person in most rooms he'd entered for long enough that he'd stopped questioning whether it was true. He was working the room with a deliberate efficiency, hand to elbow, brief words, movement on. The way you worked a room when you were managing something, not celebrating it. He had a glass of champagne he wasn't drinking. His eyes moved constantly, tracking positions. Mason watched him for 10 minutes and felt something settle into certainty. He found Victoria Sterling 7 minutes later. She was across the room in a group of 4 people. 2 older men who had the posture of board members, a woman in a green dress who was clearly her development director, and a man Mason didn't recognize who was talking fast and gesturing with his hands. Victoria was listening with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested and also keeping one eye on everything else in the room at the same time. She wore a deep burgundy dress, almost simple, and her hair was pinned back in a way that suggested she'd done it herself and then stopped thinking about it. She was younger than he'd expected, somehow, even knowing her age. Or maybe it was that she looked less constructed than the other women in the room, less like a version of herself that had been prepared for the occasion. She said something that made the man with the gesturing hands laugh and stop gesturing, and then she excused herself from the group and moved toward the hallway near the stage. Mason was still watching when Damian Reeves appeared beside him. He hadn't heard him coming. "Are you a guest of someone?" Reeves asked. His tone was the specific kind of polite that was actually the opposite of polite, the kind that made the word guest sound like the second choice between it and intruder. Mason looked at him steadily. "I am. I don't recognize you from the donor list." "I was a late addition," Mason said. This was technically accurate. He'd purchased a ticket, under a name he used for minor transactions, 48 hours earlier. The simplest cover was always the closest thing to the truth. Reeves looked at him with the evaluating gaze of someone running a quick calculation. Mason was wearing a suit that had cost $900 in 2020 and looked it. He had a mechanic's hands, permanently knuckled, with grease lines that no amount of scrubbing fully removed. He was not wearing a watch. In a room where every wrist had a watch, and the average was probably $15,000, this was apparently notable. "You work at the waterfront," Reeves said. It wasn't a question. "I've seen you. You work on the boats at Horton's dock." "I do." Reeves's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in it, a slight loosening, the way a face loosens when it decides a situation doesn't require effort. "That's an interesting choice of event for someone in your situation," he said. "It's a public fundraiser," Mason said. "Anyone can attend." "Of course." Reeves glanced around the room briefly, then back at Mason. "It's just, this isn't really the crowd you'd know, is it? These are serious donors, significant philanthropists. Not really the place for—" He paused, and the pause did the rest of the work. "For someone just browsing." Mason said nothing. "I only mention it," Reeves continued, with a smile that had the shape of graciousness and the content of something else entirely, "because the silent auction items start at $5,000. I'd hate for anyone to feel out of place." "I appreciate your concern," Mason said. It was then that he noticed Victoria Sterling. She'd come back from wherever she'd gone and was standing at the edge of the conversation, close enough to have heard most of it. She was looking at Reeves with an expression that was careful and unreadable. Then she looked at Mason. Mason met her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded slightly, picked up a fresh glass of water from a passing tray, and walked away. He found a corner near the back where he could see the stage clearly, and stood there while the program began, and did not look at the table where Damian Reeves went back to laughing at something and shaking hands with someone whose name Mason didn't know. He thought about what Martin had said. $14 million, 8 years of Victoria Sterling's work, children's shelters that had never been built, money that had moved through shell companies and vanished into accounts that were probably very comfortable. The room glittered and hummed around him. The speeches started. Someone praised the organization's 10-year impact. Someone else praised Victoria's vision. Damian Reeves was introduced as the operational backbone of the foundation and received generous applause. Mason drank his water and thought about an $80,000 variance in a construction report for a building in Brunswick that hadn't moved past 40% in 6 months. He slipped out before the dessert course. He hadn't meant to stay as long as he had. The night air outside the DeSoto was warm and thick with the particular Savannah humidity that felt like the city was breathing on you. Mason loosened the collar of his shirt and started walking toward where he'd parked, 6 blocks east, on a side street where the parking was free and the likelihood of running into anyone he knew from inside was approximately 0. He was 3 blocks from his truck when his phone rang. It was Martin. "You're up late," Mason said. "I've been going through the vendor registrations," Martin said. "I found something." Mason stopped walking. A tabby cat watched him from a porch railing 2 feet away. "Tell me." "Hearthstone isn't the only shell. I've identified 3 other companies, all incorporated within the last 4 years, all with the same registered agent in Savannah, all receiving construction payments from Sterling's accounts. The total across all 4 entities is—" Martin paused. He did this when a number was going to be significant. Somewhere north of 12 million, possibly closer to 14. Mason was quiet for a moment. A car went by, slow, its headlights sweeping the live oaks overhead and turning them briefly silver. "He's been running it for at least 4 years, Mason said. "At least." And Mason— Martin's voice changed register. "There's another thing. The most recent payment, made 6 weeks ago, went to a different account, one that's not attached to any of the shell companies. It went directly to a personal holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands. He's moving the money out." "He's moving the money out," Martin confirmed, which either means he thinks he's about to be caught, or he's about to make one more large move and then disappear. Silence on the line. "Martin," Mason said, "I need a forensic accountant, someone who can prepare documentation that would hold up to regulatory scrutiny, and I need it fast." "How fast?" Mason looked at the tabby. The tabby looked at Mason. Neither of them had a great answer. "She has another event in 3 weeks," Mason said. "The spring gala is the biggest fundraiser of her year. If he's planning a final move, that's when he'll do it." "That's not a lot of time." "No," Mason said. "It's not." He said goodnight to Martin and stood on the sidewalk for another moment, listening to the city settle into its evening sounds. Somewhere distant, music. Somewhere closer, water. The particular orchestral sound of Savannah at night, old and unbothered and ongoing. Then he walked the last 3 blocks to his truck, drove home, paid Mrs. Tran, and checked on Lily, who was asleep on top of her covers with one arm thrown over her face. He stood in her doorway for a moment. She looked so much like Claire in sleep. That hadn't faded. He thought it might, over time, the resemblance blur or soften, become less acute. It hadn't. Some mornings it still caught him sideways, fast and unexpected, before his brain caught up with itself. He went to the kitchen and sat down with Martin's preliminary report and a cup of coffee that was too strong and didn't cool down fast enough. And he started working. He found Tommy Brewer through a conversation at the dock. Tommy was 27, worked as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Savannah, and had the specific quality of someone who was very good at a job that had not yet figured out how good he was. He ate lunch on the marina wall 3 days a week because his office was 4 blocks away, and he liked boats, even though he'd never learned to sail. Mason had repaired his landlord's outboard motor twice and been introduced to Tommy in passing. Tommy had made a comment once, offhand while watching Mason work, something about the inefficiency of certain financial disclosures in the nonprofit sector, the way certain expense categories could absorb significant variance without triggering audit flags. Mason had looked up from the engine and asked a question. Tommy had asked a question back. They'd had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and ended with Mason handing him a business card. Not the doc card, the other one, the one that just had a phone number on it, and saying, "If you ever want to work on something that actually matters, call." Tommy had called 4 months later. He'd noticed something in a financial report he'd been asked to review. Not Sterling's report, a different organization's. And it had bothered him enough that he'd thought about the man at the dock who'd asked good questions. He was not, technically, employed by Mason's foundation. He was not employed by anyone in connection with this work. He was a person who spent his evenings going through publicly available financial disclosures because he was good at it and because something in him required that the numbers be honest. Mason trusted him for exactly that reason. He laid out what he had, carefully, without revealing the source of the original grant relationship, framing it simply as a concern about a local organization and an anonymous tip through his lawyer, and watched Tommy go very still in the way people go still when they recognize what they're looking at. "If this is real," Tommy said slowly, "this is not one person. This is a system. You need multiple points of authorization to move funds of this size through construction accounts. Someone inside the organization has been covering his tracks from more than one position." "What would you need to map it?" Mason asked. Tommy thought about it. "Access to the disbursement records. The full vendor files, not just the public ones. And someone inside who can confirm which authorization signatures are real." "I can get you the disbursement records," Mason said. "The vendor files are going to be harder." "How?" "I'm working on it." He was. Martin had engaged a former SEEC investigator, now private, who was pulling what he could from public regulatory filings. It wasn't the full picture, but it was enough of a skeleton that someone like Tommy, who understood how the muscle was supposed to attach, could begin to see where things were missing. They worked for 2 weeks. Tommy came to Mason's kitchen table 3 evenings, spread papers across the surface that Lily usually used for homework, and mapped the flow of money with a quiet, methodical focus that reminded Mason, unexpectedly, of himself at 27, pulling apart the logic of a trade to find out where the risk was actually hiding. By the end of the second week, they had it. 14 separate construction payments across 4 shell entities. Total misappropriated funds, approximately $12.3 million, with a potential ceiling of 14 if the Cayman transfer was included. Reeves had used 2 internal authorization signatures, his own and one belonging to a bookkeeper who Tommy suspected had either been coerced or had left the organization without realizing her signature was still being used on documents she never saw. The pattern was elegant in a bleak way. Reeves had been careful. He'd kept each individual payment below the threshold that triggered automatic audit review. He'd distributed them across enough vendor accounts that no single category spiked. He'd run it at a pace slow enough that it looked like organizational drift rather than deliberate extraction. But he'd gotten comfortable. And comfortable was where the cracks appeared. "He made 2 mistakes," Tommy said one evening, sitting at Mason's kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a highlighter that had run low. "The Cayman transfer was the first one. That's too clean, too fast, too large. It breaks his own pattern. And the second one," he tapped a page near the bottom of the stack. "He used the same shell company for a payment in 2021 that he'd already used in 2019, different project name. Same LLC. He probably thought no one would compare reports from 2 years apart." "But you did," Mason said. "I compare everything," Tommy said. He didn't say this with any particular pride, just as a statement of fact, the way Mason might say, "I checked the oil." Mason looked at the stack of documents. $12 million, 4 years. Children's shelters that existed only on paper, in reports that Victoria Sterling had trusted were accurate because she'd trusted the man who prepared them. "We need to get this to someone who can act on it," Mason said. "I know a forensic auditor at a firm in Atlanta," Tommy said. "She's done regulatory work. If she reviews this and signs off, we have something that federal investigators can use." "How long?" Tommy looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was almost 10:30. Through the hallway, a light was still on in Lily's room. She'd fallen asleep reading again, which meant Mason would go in a few minutes and take the book out of her hands and turn off the lamp. 2 weeks, Tommy said. "Maybe 10 days if she moves fast." "The gala is in 18 days. Tommy looked at him steadily. "Then she needs to move fast. Mason didn't see Victoria Sterling again until the afternoon before the gala. He hadn't planned it. He'd gone to pick up Lily from a playdate at a house on Jones Street, and he was standing on the sidewalk outside with his hands in his jacket pockets when a car pulled up across the street. A dark sedan, understated, not a car that announced itself. And Victoria Sterling got out. She was wearing jeans and a navy jacket, her hair down this time, and she was on the phone. She crossed the street at an angle, still talking, and then she looked up because she was about to walk into him. She stopped. They were close enough that Mason could see the specific quality of her expression as she registered who he was. The gala, the hallway, the thing with Damian Reeves. She said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and lowered it. "I remember you," she said. "I remember you too," he said. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. "I didn't—" She stopped, started again. "I should have said something. At the gala. What Damian said to you. I should have—" She shook her head slightly. "I didn't, and I should have." "You don't owe me an apology," Mason said. "You didn't say it." "No, but I didn't stop it either." She said it flatly, the way someone says something when they've been thinking about it for long enough that the self-justification has worn off, and what's left is just the fact. Mason looked at her. Up close, she was less composed than she'd appeared across a ballroom. Or maybe not less composed, but differently composed, the way things look different when you take away the ambient noise of a room full of people watching. "What are you doing on Jones Street?" she asked. "Picking up my daughter," he said. "You?" "There's a woman on this block who runs an after-school program out of her house. Informal thing, about 12 kids. We've been trying to find a way to formalize it, get her into a proper space, hire a second staff person." She glanced at the house across the street. "It's slow. Funding is complicated." Mason nodded. A door opened behind him and Lily appeared, still talking over her shoulder to her friend Sophie, then turning and stopping when she saw him. "Dad! Hi. Did you meet the lady?" "We were just talking," Mason said. Lily looked at Victoria with the candid assessment of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise her opinions. "Your jacket's nice," she said. "Thank you," Victoria said, and she said it like she meant it. "We have a cat," Lily said, for reasons Mason could not entirely follow. "She's strategic." Victoria looked briefly at Mason. He didn't say anything. "That's a good quality in a cat," Victoria said. Lily seemed satisfied with this response. She took Mason's hand and said, "Can we get dinner? I want the soup dumplings." "We can talk about soup dumplings," Mason said. He looked back at Victoria. She was watching Lily with an expression that was complicated in a way that had nothing to do with him. Something older, more personal. The look of someone who has spent a long time working to protect children they've never met, and occasionally, unexpectedly, finds themselves standing next to a specific one. "Good night," Mason said. "Good night," she said. He walked Lily down the block toward the truck, one hand holding her backpack, the other hand held by someone whose grip was still entirely unself-conscious in public, which he knew wasn't going to last much longer and which he was, quietly, not ready to let go of. He didn't look back. But the call from Martin came at 11:40 the following morning. "The forensic auditor finished her review," Martin said. "She's willing to sign the report and submit it for regulatory review. Mason, the final number is 13.8 million. And there's more." He paused. "Reeves has been in contact with 3 of Victoria Sterling's major institutional donors. 2 of them received informal communication suggesting the organization is undergoing a leadership transition. It's being framed as a restructuring opportunity." Mason was quiet. "He's laying the groundwork to take the organization," Mason said. "He's not just stealing the money, he wants to run it." "The gala is tomorrow night," Martin said. "If he announces a new structural arrangement in front of that room, he'll do it at the gala," Mason said. "In front of everyone. Maximum visibility, maximum legitimacy. He announces a restructuring, positions himself as the one who'll hold the organization together during the transition, and then he's got access to the next cycle of fundraising. Which is several million dollars. The dock was quiet around him. The water moved in its patient, unhurried way. A boat at the far end of the marina knocked gently against its moorings. "Martin," Mason said, "call the forensic auditor. I need her documentation ready to transmit by tomorrow evening, and I need you to make one more call." "To whom?" "I think you know," Mason said. A pause. "I don't actually think I should assume." "Federal investigators," Mason said. "Financial Crimes Division. Tell them we have a forensic audit package for a $13.8 million fraud at a registered nonprofit. Tell them the likely time of the subject's next move is tomorrow night, 8 p.m. at the DeSoto Hotel." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mason," Martin said carefully, if this goes the way you're planning, it ends the anonymity." Mason looked out at the water. The light on it in the late morning, all that moving silver. "I know," he said. "You're all right with that?" He thought about Claire. He thought about Lily. He thought about 12,000 square feet of shelter space in Brunswick that existed only as a line item in a fraudulent report, and about the children who should have had it. "Call them," he said. Martin's call came on a Tuesday, and Mason spent the rest of that day doing what he always did when something large and unresolvable was sitting in the back of his mind. He worked. There was a commercial fishing boat at Slip 14 that had been giving its owner grief for 3 weeks. A diesel injector problem that 2 other mechanics had looked at and declared mysterious. Mason didn't find it mysterious. He found it tedious, which was different, and he spent 6 hours on his back in the engine compartment with a flashlight and a patience that had been, over the last 4 years, deliberately cultivated in the same way you cultivate anything, by doing the thing repeatedly until the resistance inside you stops fighting it. The injector problem was a clogged fuel return line. It had nothing to do with the injectors. It took 40 minutes to fix once he found it. He spent the remaining time reseating a gasket that was about to fail and that the owner didn't know about yet, and then he wrote up the invoice and sat on the dock in the late afternoon and let the sun work on his face for a while. He thought about what Martin had said, the anonymity ending. He'd known, when he built the structure of the Drake Foundation, that it was provisional. Everything was provisional. Claire had taught him that, not through any lesson she'd intended to give, but through the blunt and absolute fact of her absence, which had arrived without warning and rearranged every assumption he'd quietly held about how the future was organized. You planned. You built structures. You made decisions based on the idea that the scaffolding would hold. And then sometimes the scaffolding didn't hold, and you learned something about which parts of yourself were load-bearing and which parts had just been decorative. The anonymity had been load-bearing for 4 years. It had allowed him to give without transaction, to help without expectation, to be the quiet mechanism behind things that mattered without ever having to stand in front of them and accept the weight of being seen. He wasn't sure he was ready to lose that. He also wasn't sure he had the right to protect it at the cost of what he now knew. The sun moved, the water moved. Down the dock, 2 men were arguing cheerfully about the right way to tie a bowline knot, the argument that had probably been happening on docks since the invention of boats and would continue indefinitely. A pelican landed on the piling 6 feet away and regarded Mason with the specific indifference of a creature that has never once questioned its right to be exactly where it is. Mason got up and went home to start dinner before Lily got off the school bus. She came in at 3:40 with a drawing she'd made in art class, a boat, blue, with a flag on it that appeared to be a cat, and 2 figures on the deck that Mason understood were supposed to be them. "The flag," he said. "It's a cat flag," Lily said, hanging up her backpack with the focused inefficiency that all 8-year-olds bring to hanging up backpacks, which is to say the backpack made it onto the hook on the 3rd attempt and was immediately threatening to fall off again. "What does the cat flag mean?" "It means the boat is ours," she said, as though this were obvious. Mason taped it to the refrigerator next to the drawing of the marina she'd done in February, and the one of Mrs. Tran's dog that looked more like a cloud with legs. And he did not think about federal investigators or shell companies or $13.8 million for the next 2 hours, which was, he recognized, the most useful thing Lily did for him without knowing she was doing it. She grounded him. That was the word for it. She kept him in the specific gravity of the present tense, not because she demanded it, but because she existed in it so completely that it was impossible to be in the same room with her and remain elsewhere. They had soup dumplings for dinner. He'd remembered. She fell asleep at 9, the book still in her hands, and he went in and turned out the light, and stood in the doorway for a moment with the familiar weight of the thing he never had words for. The particular love that had no performance in it, because there was no audience. Just the fact of her, breathing, small, entirely real. Then he went back to the kitchen and called Tommy. "The audit package goes to Martin tomorrow morning," Tommy said, without preamble. "I had her look at the Cayman transfer again. She's added a secondary analysis. The funds appear to have moved through 2 intermediary accounts before landing. She can trace the first hop, but not the second. That'll be for the investigators to pursue." "Is the primary documentation clean enough?" "It's clean," Tommy said. He sounded tired. Not defeated. Tommy didn't do defeated, but the specific tiredness of someone who had been precise for a very long time and was feeling the cost of it. "Mason, I want to ask you something." "Okay. When this is done, when this goes to investigators and they move on it, what happens to the organization, to Sterling's programs?" Mason had thought about this. "The fraud is Reeves's," he said. "The programs are real. The donors are real. If the investigation is handled right, the organization survives it. Tighter than before, probably, but it survives. And the kids who are supposed to be in those shelters? That's what the rest of the money is for," Mason said. A pause. "The foundation." "The foundation." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay, I'll have the package to Martin by 8 a.m. "Thank you, Tommy." "Don't thank me," Tommy said. "I didn't do this for thanks." Another pause. "I did it because someone was stealing money from kids. That's a thing that shouldn't happen." "No," Mason said. "It shouldn't." He hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while with the lights low and the house quiet, and the weight of tomorrow arranged in front of him like pieces of something he hadn't yet figured out how to carry. He wasn't afraid, exactly. It was something adjacent to fear. The awareness that a door was about to open that would not close again, that the quiet life he'd built on this waterfront, the dock job and the truck and the 2-bedroom rental and the version of himself that nobody looked too closely at, was about to become insufficient as a cover story. People would know. Some of them would be impressed. Some of them would be angry, in the particular way people get angry when they find out someone has been humble in front of them and didn't have to be. And some of them, the ones he thought about least and probably should think about more, would simply be confused because the Mason Drake they knew fixed boat engines and made soup dumplings and had a daughter who drew cat flags, and that Mason Drake was true, and the other one was also true. And people generally found it uncomfortable when both things were true at the same time. He thought for a moment about Victoria Sterling's face on the sidewalk on Jones Street, the way she'd looked at Lily, the way she'd said I should have said something, flat and honest, with the self-justification already worn off. He put it away and went to bed. The next morning he was at the dock by 6:30. He had 3 boats scheduled and a delivery of parts that was arriving by 9. He worked through the morning with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the best thing you could do with a large, unresolvable thing sitting on the back burner was to do the work in front of you. Well, because the work in front of you was also real and also mattered, and was also, in its own way, a form of integrity. At 11, his phone buzzed with a text from Martin. "Package received. Auditor signed. Transmitting to federal contacts this afternoon." He didn't respond. There was nothing to add. By 2 o'clock, the afternoon had turned hot and close the way Savannah afternoons turned in late spring, not unbearably, but with a particular insistence, the kind of heat that made you aware of your own skin. He was finishing the last of the 3 boats when he heard footsteps on the dock behind him that didn't belong to anyone he knew. He turned around. Damian Reeves was standing 10 feet away. He was dressed casually, slacks, a light jacket, and he was alone, which meant either he was very confident or very stupid, and Mason, from everything he'd seen, did not think Damian Reeves was stupid. "Thought I'd find you here," Reeves said. Mason set down the wrench he was holding, slowly. "How can I help you?" Reeves looked around the dock with the mildly appreciative expression of someone visiting a place they find quaint. "Nice spot. I can see the appeal." He looked back at Mason. "I had an interesting conversation this morning. One of our institutional donors called to ask whether we were aware of a forensic review being conducted on our construction accounts." Mason said nothing. That's a strange thing to ask, Reeves continued, moving a step closer. We don't have any active forensic reviews. I would know, obviously. I oversee financial operations. He tilted his head slightly. But someone has been asking questions, going back through old disbursement records, trying to reconstruct vendor documentation. He paused. Are you following me? I'm listening, Mason said. Good. Reeves's tone shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way a temperature shifts when a cloud moves. I want to be direct with you. I don't know how you got access to our records. I don't know who you're working with, but I can tell you that whatever you think you've found, it's not going to land the way you're imagining. These things are complicated. There are explanations, and the people who would review any such documentation are people I know personally. That's confident, Mason said. I'm a careful person, Reeves said. I've been careful for a long time. He let that sit for a moment. Whatever your angle is here, and I'm genuinely curious because you're an interesting one, I'll give you that, it's not going to work. And I'd hate for you to create a problem for yourself over something that you don't fully understand. Mason looked at him. He thought about Claire. He thought about Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, the boat with the cat flag. He thought about $13.8 million and 4 shell companies and a bookkeeper whose signature had been used on documents she'd never seen. I appreciate you coming by, Mason said. Reeves studied him for a moment, looking for something. Uncertainty, maybe, or the particular flinch of someone who's been caught overreaching. He didn't find it, which seemed to bother him in a way he managed but couldn't quite hide. You should come to the gala tomorrow night, Reeves said. As my guest. I'll have a ticket waiting for you. His smile had the shape of graciousness and the content of a test. It should be an interesting evening. I'll be there, Mason said. That seemed to surprise Reeves briefly. He recovered it fast. The man was practiced at recovering, and nodded once and walked back down the dock, unhurried, with his jacket catching the afternoon light in the casual way of someone who has never once had to think about whether the lighting was flattering. Mason picked up his wrench and went back to work. His hands were perfectly steady. He thought about that for a moment. He wasn't sure if it meant he was calm or if it meant he'd finally arrived somewhere past the point where his hands had opinions about things. Probably the second one. Probably that was either a good sign or a bad one, and he didn't have enough perspective to know which. At 3:30, he went to get Lily from the school bus. She was in a mood he recognized, the slightly compressed inward-facing mood that happened when something at school had bothered her and she was working out whether she wanted to talk about it. He didn't push. He drove home with the radio on a country station she usually liked, and somewhere around the third song she said, "Sophie said my drawing wasn't a real cat." Which drawing? The boat, with the flag. He considered this. Was she being mean about it? No, Lily said, fairly. She just said cats don't look like that. What does a cat look like? You know what a cat looks like, Dad. I know what a real cat looks like, Mason said. Your drawing is a flag. Flag cats look different. Lily thought about this with the seriousness she applied to most things. That's a good point, she said. She seemed better after that. They got home and she started her homework at the kitchen table while he changed out of his work clothes and stood in his bedroom for a moment, looking at the gray suit hanging on the back of the closet door. He'd need to press it tonight. Victoria Sterling had a meeting she hadn't anticipated. It came in the form of her development director, a woman named Pamela who had worked with Victoria for 6 years, and who had the particular quality of people who are very good at their jobs and very bad at pretending things are fine when things are not fine. Pamela appeared in Victoria's office at 4:15 and closed the door behind her, which was the signal Victoria had learned to read, as this is not a quick thing. I got a call from Whitmore Group, Pamela said. Whitmore Group was one of their largest institutional donors, a private family foundation that had contributed somewhere in the range of $2 million over 3 years. They wanted to know about a restructuring. Victoria looked up from the budget review she'd been doing. What restructuring? That's what I said, Pamela said. Her voice was carefully modulated in the way it got when she was managing her own anxiety, which Victoria recognized because she'd seen it often enough. They said they'd received informal communication from someone within our organization suggesting that leadership was in transition and that a new partnership structure was being developed. Victoria set down her pen. Those were their words? She said. Partnership structure. I'm reading from my notes, Pamela said. She held up her phone. Victoria looked at it. Then she looked at the closed door. Then she looked at her desk, where Damien's most recent financial summary was sitting in a folder she'd been meaning to review for the past 3 days, having been moved down the priority list 3 times by things that turned out to be more urgent. Who sent them that communication? Victoria said. They wouldn't say specifically, but the language they used… Pamela paused. Victoria, it sounded like it came from inside, like someone with operational knowledge. Victoria stood up from her desk. She moved to the window which looked out over a courtyard behind the building, a small garden that one of their former clients had helped plant 3 years ago, still there, still managing itself with the casual persistence of growing things. Get me the full Whitmore correspondence, she said, and pull every piece of external communication that's gone out of this office in the last 60 days. I want to see it. That's a lot of… I know, Victoria said. Do it anyway. Pamela left. Victoria stood at the window for another moment. She'd built this organization from a single idea in a rented room when she was 24 years old. She'd spent 6 years making sure every dollar went where it was supposed to go. Every program was evaluated honestly. Every decision was made in service of the people the organization existed for. She wasn't naive. She knew nonprofits failed, knew they got corrupted, knew that good intentions and poor oversight was its own kind of negligence. She'd worked hard to avoid that. But oversight had a limit. There were things you could verify externally and things you had to trust internally, and Damien had been internal for 8 years. He'd been there since the 2nd year, when she was still figuring out what she was doing, and he'd been competent and dependable and organized in ways that had made the organization's growth possible. She'd trusted him because she'd watched him work, and the work had appeared for years, to be honest. Appeared. She pressed her hands flat on the windowsill and thought about the man at the gala, the one Damien had gone after with that careful, deliberate rudeness, the one who'd stood there without flinching and walked away with something in his posture that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. She'd asked around after the gala, the way you ask around in a city where everyone knows the waterfront. Mason Drake, boat mechanic. Horton's Marina, single father. Quiet, people said. Good at his job. Kept to himself. She'd thought about him on Jones Street, the way he'd looked at her when she apologized, not with magnanimity or performance, but with a straightforwardness that had left her slightly off balance. She wasn't used to people who didn't want anything from the interaction, and she thought about his daughter, Lily, the small, serious girl who had informed her without prompting that their cat was strategic. She didn't know why she kept thinking about them. Probably she did know and wasn't ready to say it to herself yet. She moved back to her desk and opened Damien's financial summary and began reading it for the first time with the kind of attention she should have been paying to it all along. It looked fine. That was the problem. It looked exactly fine. She got home at 8 that evening. She lived alone in a house in the Ardsley Park neighborhood. Too big, she'd always thought, for one person. But she'd bought it because it had a guest room she'd earmarked for her youngest sister and a kitchen she actually wanted to cook in. And she'd been right about the kitchen and wrong about her sister, who had moved to Portland instead. And the guest room was currently being used to store boxes she hadn't unpacked in 2 years. She ate leftover pasta standing at the kitchen counter and thought about Pamela's phone and the phrase partnership structure, and the way Damien had not been in the office when she'd looked for him at 5 o'clock. She thought about tomorrow night, the gala. 300 people, most of them donors or prospective donors or journalists or city officials, all of them assembled in the same room where Damien intended to… what? Announce something, maneuver something into place. The vision of it was still forming, still blurry at the edges, but she felt its shape, and the shape was wrong. She needed more information. She set down her fork and picked up her phone. The contact she was looking for wasn't one she called often. A woman named Frances who worked in regulatory compliance and had been a friend since graduate school. The kind of friend you called when you needed someone who would be honest with you, even when honest was hard to hear. Frances picked up on the second ring. "I need someone to look at something for me," Victoria said. Quietly. How quietly? Very. A pause. How soon? The gala is tomorrow night, Victoria said. I don't know what I'm looking for exactly, but something is wrong and I can't see it from where I'm standing. Francis was quiet for a moment, then, send me everything you have on your construction accounts for the last 3 years. That's a lot of documentation. Then you'd better start scanning, Francis said. Victoria looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was 8:47. Okay, she said. She went to her home office and started scanning. She was still at it at midnight, feeding documents into the scanner with the methodical persistence of someone who didn't yet know exactly what they were looking for but understood, with a certainty that sat low in her chest and didn't move, that they were going to find something. The gala was in 19 hours. She was not yet aware that the same question was being asked about the same documents in a house 6 miles away by a man who already had the answers and had spent 2 weeks building a case that was, as of that afternoon, in the hands of federal investigators. She was not yet aware that the quiet mechanic she'd seen twice, once in a ballroom where she'd said nothing, once on a sidewalk where she'd said not quite enough, was the center of the thing she was circling. She just kept scanning, because it was all she could do, and because doing nothing was something she had never been particularly good at, and because somewhere in the careful architecture of her work, someone had made a space for themselves to be dishonest in, and she intended to find it. The scanner ran. The pages went through. Outside, Savannah moved through its own quiet evening, unhurried, old, the live oaks holding their shapes in the dark, the water doing what water does. Tomorrow was coming regardless. Victoria found the first real crack at 2:17 in the morning. She almost missed it. She'd been scanning for hours, feeding documents through in batches, and the fatigue had started doing what fatigue does, flattening things, making the 10th page look like the first page, making the numbers blur at the edges in a way that felt like reading underwater. She'd gotten up twice for water, and once to stand in her kitchen and press her palms flat on the counter and remind herself to breathe. The crack was in a project reconciliation form from 18 months ago. A shelter renovation in Valdosta, a project she remembered specifically because she'd visited the site herself twice and spoken with the director who ran it, a woman named Carolyn who had spent 20 years building that shelter from a 2-room operation into something that served 60 families a year. The renovation had been real. Mason had seen it with her own eyes. The tile floors, the new windows, the repainted walls, all of it real. But the amount on the reconciliation form was $412,000. The contracted amount she remembered approving was $280,000. She stared at that for a long time. Then she pulled the original contract. $280,000, as she remembered. Then she pulled the payment records. $412,000, distributed across 3 invoices. The third invoice was from a vendor she didn't recognize, not the contractor who'd done the actual work, a company called Seabrook Development Solutions, payment issued 6 weeks after the renovation was complete. She opened her laptop and searched Seabrook Development Solutions. Nothing. A registered address in Savannah that turned out, when she pulled up the map, to be a UPS store. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Francis back. It was 2:23 in the morning. Francis answered on the 4th ring, which told Victoria she hadn't been sleeping either. I found something, Victoria said. Tell me. She told her about Seabrook, about the invoice, about the gap between the contracted amount and what had actually been paid. While she was talking, she was pulling more files, cross-referencing vendor names the way she should have been doing all along, the way she'd trusted someone else to do all along. How many projects do you have active construction accounts on? Francis asked. In the last 3 years? 11? Pull the reconciliation form on every one of them tonight, Francis said. Look for vendors that were added after the primary contractor completed work. Look for payment dates that don't correspond to project timelines. And Victoria, her voice shifted. Don't talk to anyone on your staff until you've done this. Not tonight, not tomorrow morning. You think it's internal. Well, I think if you found one invoice from a ghost company at 2 in the morning while exhausted, there's probably more than one invoice. And the person who processed those invoices either knows about it or was too close to it to be objective right now. Victoria looked at the folder on her desk. Damien's name was on the tab. She'd written it there herself, 2 years ago, during a reorganization of the filing system. His handwriting was neat. She'd always thought that about him. The neatness of his work, how clean everything looked when Damien handled it. "Okay," she said. "I'll call you at 6. She hung up and pulled the next reconciliation form. By 4 in the morning, she had found 3 more Seabrook invoices and 2 payments to a company called Brightwater Capital Consulting that didn't exist in any business registry she could access. Total gap between approved contracts and actual disbursements, somewhere above 800,000, and she was only 5 projects into the 11. She made coffee she didn't drink and kept going. The sun came up and found her at her desk with her jacket still on, surrounded by paper, with a yellow legal pad where she'd been writing numbers and columns the way she'd learned to do in college when the spreadsheet felt too clinical and she needed to see the shape of something with her own hand. The shape of this was ugly. She sat with it for a while. Not falling apart. That wasn't Victoria's way. Or at least it wasn't her daytime way. The falling apart happened privately, in installments, usually in the car where she could be alone with it for the length of a drive, and then put it away before she had to be anything for anyone. But she sat with the specific feeling of having trusted someone for 8 years, having relied on their competence and their apparent integrity, having given them access to the financial machinery of everything she'd built, and finding out, at 4 in the morning in her home office, that the access had been used for something that had nothing to do with the work. She thought about the children's shelter in Brunswick, the one that should have been finished 8 months ago. She'd visited the site last fall, a half-framed structure, paused, the director apologetic about delays. A contractor she now suspected had never been real, a project that existed in the reports as 40% complete and in reality as a concrete slab and a pile of lumber going gray in the Georgia weather. She thought about the families who were supposed to be in that building. Then she stopped sitting with it and started making a list. Her phone rang at 8:47. She didn't recognize the number, but the area code was Atlanta, and she'd been half expecting a call from someone she didn't know, so she answered. "Ms. Sterling," said a woman's voice, professional and unhurried. "My name is Agent Carla Deming. I'm with the Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI Field Office in Atlanta. I'm calling because we received documentation last night that relates to your organization's financial accounts. I'd like to speak with you this morning if you're available." Victoria looked at her legal pad, at the columns of numbers in her own handwriting. "Yes," she said, "I'm available. Are you familiar with the name Mason Drake?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I've met him," she said. Agent Deming's voice didn't change register. "We received a forensic audit package last night through an attorney named Martin Cho, representing an organization called the Drake Foundation. The package documents a systematic financial fraud within your organization spanning approximately 4 years and totaling in excess of $13 million. The audit was compiled in cooperation with a forensic accountant and verified by a licensed forensic auditor." A pause. "Ms. Sterling, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your Executive Vice President of Finance." Victoria set down her pen. "I have some questions about him myself," she said. They talked for 40 minutes. Victoria told the agent what she'd found during the night. The ghost vendors, the inflated invoices, the gap amounts. Agent Deming listened with the focused, minimal response attention of someone who was learning things that confirmed rather than surprised, and occasionally asked questions so specific that they told Victoria exactly how detailed the documentation in the audit package already was. At the end of the call, Agent Deming said, "We're aware that your organization has a fundraising event tonight." "The Spring Gala," Victoria said, 7 p.m. at the DeSoto. "We'd like to handle this in a way that minimizes disruption to your organization and your donors. We'll have personnel present tonight. I want to be direct with you about what we're planning, but I need to ask you, are you willing to cooperate with the timing of our response?" Victoria looked at her window. The Ardsley Park neighborhood was going about its morning outside. A dog walker, a car backing out of a driveway, a kid on a bicycle taking the corner too fast and correcting at the last second. "What do you need from me?" Victoria said. Agent Deming told her. When the call ended, Victoria sat for another moment, and then she picked up her phone and called Mason Drake. He answered on the second ring. "You could have told me," she said. Not angry, or not only angry. There was something else in it that she wasn't sure she had a word for yet. A short silence on his end. "I wasn't sure how," he said. "That's not good enough." "No," he said. It's not. She appreciated that he didn't try to justify it. She wasn't sure what she would have done if he had. The FBI called me, she said. I know. Martin called me first. How long have you known about Damien? Definitively, 3 weeks. The first red flag was about 8 weeks ago. She processed that. And the foundation, the Drake Foundation. Another pause. She'd thought he might try to manage this part, soften the timeline, frame it carefully, make it easier to receive. He didn't. 5 years, he said, starting with an initial grant of $400,000. Total, over 5 years, somewhere around $22 million, distributed across a number of your programs. $22 million. She'd known the number from the FBI call, but hearing it from him was different. $22 million. Anonymous. 5 years of her organization's growth, her program expansion, her ability to say yes to things she might otherwise have had to say no to, traced in the end back to a man she'd watched get insulted at her own event and said nothing. Why anonymous? She said. He thought about it. She could tell there was a quality to his silences, she was learning, that was different from evasion. He actually thought before he answered. I didn't want the money to come with my name attached, he said. When someone knows who the donor is, the relationship changes, the dynamic changes. I wanted the programs to be able to operate without that weight, without feeling obligated to you. Yes. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window. The morning light was doing something particular to the garden, slanted and gold, the kind of morning light that makes everything look briefly like a painting of itself. The FBI wants me at the gala tonight, she said. They want to handle the arrest publicly. I know, Martin was informed. Will you be there? The question came out before she'd entirely decided to ask it. She heard it land and didn't try to pull it back. Yes, Mason said. She nodded, which was pointless over a phone, but her body needed to do something. Okay, she said. I'll see you tonight. She hung up and stood at the window for another minute, thinking about $22 million and a gray suit that probably didn't fit quite right, and a little girl who had opinions about flag cats. Then she went to shower and get dressed because the gala was in 10 hours, and she had a great deal to do before then. The day moved with the particular momentum of days that are carrying something large inside them. The surface normal, the ordinary tasks still requiring completion, while underneath, the weight of the evening pressed steadily forward. Mason dropped Lily at school, drove to the dock, told the owner that he'd need to take the afternoon off. Ray, who owned the marina, was a 60-year-old man with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking at water and making assessments, and he said, all right, with the economy of a man who didn't require explanation, which was one of the things Mason had always respected about him. He came home and pressed the gray suit. Then he sat at his kitchen table and called Martin. Federal personnel are confirmed for the venue, Martin said. Agent Deming's team. Plain clothes until the moment of the arrest. How many? 4 agents inside the room, 2 more in the lobby. They'll have Reeves's known associates under observation as well. There's a concern he may have someone on the outside monitoring. A pause. Mason, I want to make sure you've thought about the exposure tonight. When Victoria speaks, I've thought about it. It's going to change things. I know. The press will pick it up. Not tonight, maybe, but within 24 hours. The anonymous donor behind the Sterling Foundation's growth for 5 years turns out to be a boat mechanic on the Savannah waterfront. That's a story people will want to write. I know that too. Are you all right with it? Mason looked at Lily's drawing on the refrigerator. The boat, the cat flag, the 2 figures on the deck. I'm not all right or not all right, he said. It's just what it is now. Martin was quiet for a moment. You did the right thing, he said. It wasn't something Martin said often, which was why it meant something when he did. Not yet, Mason said. Tonight it'll be done. Then we'll see. He picked up Lily from school at 3:15 and didn't tell her anything about the evening, only that Mrs. Tran was coming over at 5 and that he had an event to go to. The fancy one? Lily asked. How do you know it's fancy? You ironed your suit, she said. You only ironed the suit for fancy. He couldn't argue with that. He helped her with her homework, a math worksheet she found boring and a reading response she found interesting, and the contrast was apparent in the quality of her handwriting on each. He made her a snack and sat across from her while she read and thought about Tommy Brewer's kitchen table visits, the highlighter running low, the columns of numbers that had mapped out 4 years of someone else's dishonesty. He thought about Damian Reeves standing on his dock in the afternoon light, confident, managing the conversation the way he managed everything. Efficiently, with calculated grace, already 3 steps ahead of where he thought Mason was. He hadn't been 3 steps ahead. He'd been standing exactly where Mason had expected him to stand. At 4:15, his phone buzzed. It was Tommy. "I'm watching the Sterling Foundation social media," Tommy said. Damian posted this morning. Photo from the venue, set-up crew in the background, caption about looking forward to tonight's announcement. A pause. "He's not hiding. He doesn't think he has anything to hide from," Mason said. "He thinks he handled it yesterday." "What did he say to you, on the dock?" "He warned me off, politely. Told me the people who would review the documentation were people he knew. Does he actually know them?" "He might. It doesn't matter." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you nervous?" Mason considered the question. "No," he said. He stopped, tried to find the word that was actually accurate. Ready wasn't right. Ready implied a kind of confidence he didn't have, and confidence wasn't the thing he was feeling. What he was feeling was more like the particular state that comes after you've made an irreversible decision, and the only remaining direction is forward, and your body has finally agreed with your mind about this. "I'm done waiting," he said. "Okay," Tommy said. "Good." Another pause. "Mason, for what it's worth, I looked into your foundation before I agreed to work with you. The things it's funded, the programs. I didn't tell you that before because it felt like the wrong time." He paused again. "It's a good thing you built." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you, Tommy." "Don't thank me," Tommy said for the second time. "I'm serious, just a small, slightly uncomfortable sound that might have been a laugh. Go wear the suit." Mrs. Tron arrived at 5, carrying a small container of something that smelled like ginger and sesame, which she handed to Lily with the formality of a person presenting something that required acknowledgement, and Lily acknowledged it with the seriousness that Mrs. Tron required. Mason put on the suit. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment. He hadn't spent a lot of time in front of mirrors in the last 4 years. It wasn't avoidance exactly. It was more that he'd stopped having the habit, having moved away from a life that required daily assessment of how he looked to others. The man in the mirror was 32 and looked like someone who worked outside. Not weathered, not old, but with the specific quality of a person whose face had been exposed to things, whose hands showed their history. The suit fit better than he'd expected, considering. The gray had been a good choice in 2020 and remained a reasonable choice now. He thought for a moment that Claire would have said something about the tie. She'd had opinions about ties. She thought he picked the wrong ones, consistently, with a confidence that the wrongness never seemed to shake. He didn't know if he was wearing the wrong tie tonight. He had 2. He was wearing the darker one. "Dad," Lily called from the hallway, "you look like a lawyer." "Is that good?" She appeared in the doorway and appraised him with genuine consideration. "You look like a lawyer who also fixes boats," she said. "Which is better?" "I'll take it," he said. He kissed her forehead, said goodnight to Mrs. Tron, and walked out into the Savannah evening. The city was doing its early evening thing, the light going amber, the temperature dropping a degree or two, the streets in the historic district picking up the low hum of people moving toward dinner and events, and the ongoing business of being somewhere particular. Mason drove to the DeSoto in the truck, which was the only vehicle he had, and parked in the same side street he'd used 2 weeks ago. He sat in the truck for a moment. Somewhere in that hotel, Damian Reeves was putting on his own suit and preparing his announcement and believing still that the room was his. Somewhere in that hotel, or arriving at it, federal agents in evening wear were finding their positions. And somewhere, he didn't know exactly where, Victoria Sterling was getting ready for the most complicated night of her professional life, carrying a full night's worth of discovered numbers and a phone call with the FBI and the weight of 8 years of built trust that had turned out to be something other than what it looked like. He got out of the truck. The evening air was warm and smelled like the city, river and old stone, and the distant sweetness of something blooming somewhere. He walked toward the hotel entrance. He was halfway down the block when his phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Martin, just 3 words. Package is confirmed. Mason put the phone in his pocket. He walked through the hotel doors, into the bright lobby, toward the elevator that would take him to the 2nd floor, where 300 people in a ballroom and the end of 4 years of careful quiet were all waiting. His hands were steady. He rode the elevator up. The ballroom at the DeSoto was fuller than the last time. Mason noticed this immediately when the elevator doors opened and he stepped into the 2nd floor corridor. The sound of it, 300 people generating the specific frequency of a room that believes it is assembled for something important. The chandeliers were doing their work. The floral arrangements on each table were extravagant in the way that signaled significant money had changed hands to produce them, which was, Mason supposed, the point. You didn't raise funds by looking like you needed them. He moved through the lobby crowd and found a position near the far wall of the ballroom entrance, where he could see most of the room without being immediately visible from the stage. Old habit. When you spent enough time managing large amounts of other people's money, you learned to read a room from its edges before you entered the center of it. He found Reeves within 90 seconds. Damien was near the stage in conversation with 2 men Mason recognized from the organizational board. Older, silver-haired, the posture of people who had been deferred to for long enough that it had become structural. Reeves was relaxed. Not performing relaxation, actually relaxed, the looseness of a man who had run the calculation and liked the result. He was in a dark suit, better cut than Mason's, with the small details attended to in the way that came naturally to people who had spent their careers in rooms like this one. He laughed at something one of the board members said. He put his hand on the man's arm briefly. The gesture of someone who understands that physical contact, used correctly, registers as warmth and confidence simultaneously. He hadn't seen Mason yet. Mason looked for the federal agents next. Agent Deming had told Victoria they'd be in plain clothes, and Mason had expected they'd be good at it, and they were. He spotted 2 of them only because he was looking, a man near the bar who was not drinking his drink, and a woman near the side exit whose eyes moved in the specific pattern of someone doing continuous situational assessment. The other 2 he didn't find, which meant they were better positioned or he was missing something, and he decided it was more likely the latter. He accepted a glass of water from a passing tray. Victoria arrived 7 minutes later. He knew she'd arrived not because he saw her, but because of the change in the room. The way a significant number of the people in it recalibrated their attention toward the entrance without any obvious coordination. He turned. She was in a deep green dress, floor-length, with her hair down in a way that was clearly deliberate without being effortful. She looked composed. Not unnaturally composed, not the kind of composed that was actually brittle, but the composed of someone who had spent a long night finding terrible things and then made a decision about how to carry them. She moved into the room with the particular quality of a person walking into a place they built who has just discovered something in the walls. She found him in about 30 seconds. He hadn't expected that. He'd been near the wall, deliberately, and the room was full. But she looked across it with the direct efficiency of someone who knew what they were looking for, and when her eyes landed on him, they stayed there just long enough to confirm the thing, and then she moved toward the receiving area to greet the board members. She didn't come to him. She didn't need to. Not yet. They'd said what needed to be said that morning. Pamela appeared at Victoria's elbow, and Victoria took a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink, and began working the room with the focused attention of someone who was thinking about 3 things at once and showing none of them. Mason watched Reeves watch Victoria enter. There was a moment, quick, barely there, where something moved across Reeves's face that wasn't quite confidence. Not doubt either, more like the awareness of a variable. He recovered it fast, went back to his conversation, but Mason had seen it and filed it. Reeves knew Victoria had been in her files last night. He didn't know how much she'd found. That was the variable. The formal program began at 7:45. An MC from the city's Arts Council, brief and warm, good at the job. A video played on the screens flanking the stage. 15 years of the Sterling Foundation's work, compressed into 4 minutes, shelter openings and women's programs and children's faces, and the careful, cumulative evidence of what it looked like to put money where you said you were going to put it. Mason had seen parts of this work firsthand, in the quarterly reports Martin forwarded, in the site photographs attached to program updates, He hadn't seen it assembled like this. It hit differently assembled. He noticed that Pamela, sitting near the front of the room, had her phone out and was not watching the video. The video ended. Applause. The MC returned to introduce the first speaker, a city council member who spoke about the organization's community impact with the practiced warmth of someone who had delivered this kind of speech often and was still, somehow, sincere about it. Mason kept his eyes on Reeves. Reeves was in his seat at the head table, turned slightly toward the stage, his expression attending. To anyone watching, he looked like a dedicated professional listening to deserved praise for his organization. His posture was easy. He had his champagne glass in his hand, and he'd actually been drinking it. Another tell, Mason thought, if you were looking for one. Men who were running something on the edge of collapsing didn't usually drink at events. Men who thought they'd already managed the threat did. The council member finished. More applause. The MC returned. And now, the MC said, with the particular warmth of a hosting professional saving the main thing, I'd like to invite to the stage a woman who has spent 15 years proving that the most important work is also the hardest work, the founder and CEO of the Sterling Foundation, Victoria Sterling. The applause was immediate and substantial. 300 people, some of whom had been waiting for this moment for weeks, some of whom had given significant money to this organization and wanted to see the person behind it, some of whom just understood that they were in the presence of something that deserved the response. Victoria walked to the stage. She stood at the podium and looked out at the room for a moment before speaking. Just a moment, brief enough that most people probably didn't register it as a pause. But Mason registered it. She was making a decision. Thank you, she said. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your generosity, your trust, and for being part of something that I believe, all genuinely believe in, is worth fighting for. She paused. I had a different speech prepared for tonight, she said. The room shifted, not dramatically. A slight change in the quality of attention, the way a room shifts when it realizes the script has changed. I was going to talk about our growth over the past year, our program expansion, our plans for the next phase of shelter construction. I was going to thank our staff and our board and our donors by name. She looked at the room steadily. I'm still going to do some of that, but first I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you directly, because I think the people in this room have earned the truth more than they've earned a polished presentation. The silence was very clean now, even the ambient sound that rooms generate. The shifting, the soft collision of glassware, had gone quiet. Over the past 18 hours, Victoria said, I've learned that a significant portion of the funding entrusted to this organization over the past 4 years did not go where it was supposed to go. I've learned that money intended for construction projects that should have housed hundreds of families was systematically redirected through fraudulent vendor accounts into private accounts. I've learned that the scope of this fraud is extensive. She didn't look away from the room when she said this. I am deeply sorry. The failure of oversight that allowed this to happen is a failure I take personally, and I will spend whatever time is necessary correcting it. The room had stopped breathing. Reeves had gone very still at the head table. But I also need to tell you something else tonight, Victoria said. Something that, honestly, I'm still absorbing myself. She looked down at the podium for a moment, not performing hesitation, actually finding her place in the thing she was about to say. For 5 years, this organization has had an anonymous donor, a benefactor who, without ever asking for recognition or visibility or any kind of return, has contributed, across dozens of our programs and initiatives. She paused. More than $22 million. The room made a sound, not words, just the collective movement of air that happens when several hundred people absorb a number. I didn't know who this person was, Victoria said. That was deliberate on their part. The money came through a foundation, structured specifically to protect the donor's identity, because the donor believed, and I now understand this fully, that the work should speak for itself, not the name behind it. She looked up, looked across the room, found Mason near the far wall. His name is Mason Drake. The room turned. All of it, or enough of it to create the sensation of all of it, a large collective movement of attention toward the wall where Mason was standing. He had known this was coming. He had agreed to it, had spent the previous night accepting it. He was still not entirely prepared for the specific physical sensation of 300 people looking at you simultaneously, the weight of that many pairs of eyes, the way it reorganized the air in the room. He did not move. He held the eye contact with Victoria for a moment, and then he looked at the room steadily, and he didn't smile or gesture or perform anything. He just let it be what it was. Mason has spent the past 4 years living and working on the Savannah waterfront as a boat mechanic, Victoria said. Some of you may have seen him here 2 weeks ago at our last event. She paused, and the pause carried the weight of what she wasn't saying directly, which everyone in the room who had been at the previous event understood. He was not treated the way a person should be treated, and the irony of that, the specific irony, is something I'll be thinking about for a long time. She looked back at Mason. "Thank you," she said, "for the work, for the integrity, and for caring enough to protect it when I couldn't see it clearly." The applause started near the front and moved backward through the room like something rolling downhill, gaining mass, gaining sound, arriving at the back wall as something substantial. Mason stood in it. He didn't know what to do with his face. He settled for looking at the floor briefly, which he recognized was slightly awkward, and then looking up again, which was better. He didn't look at Reeves. Not yet. Victoria stepped back from the podium. The MC returned, saying something. Mason couldn't quite track the words because the room was still generating its response, and the audio from the stage was getting partially absorbed by it. And then Reeves stood up. It happened quickly. Reeves moved from his chair to the stage with the smooth efficiency of someone who had always had access to the stage and intended to use that access now, before the room's attention could settle into something he couldn't manage. He put his hand briefly on the MC's shoulder, the same gesture he'd used with the board member, the one that registered as warm and confident, and the MC stepped aside because Damian Reeves was the EVP of Finance, and he often spoke at these events, and the MC had not been briefed on what was about to happen. "Thank you, Victoria," Reeves said into the microphone with the same composed warmth he'd used all evening. "That was a moving acknowledgement, and I know I speak for the entire team when I say we're grateful for Mr. Drake's support." He turned slightly, the half-turn of a speaker redirecting attention from a specific moment to a broader frame. "I'd like to take a moment with the board's blessing to discuss some exciting structural developments for the Foundation's next phase." The screens on either side of the stage changed. Reeves didn't notice immediately. He was in his turn, setting up the rhetorical shift, and the screens were behind him. But the room noticed. The room saw the screens go from the Sterling Foundation's logo to a document, dense, formatted, financial, with a title across the top that read, Forensic Audit Report. Sterling Foundation Financial Fraud Investigation. The first page was a summary table. 14 fraudulent vendor entities. 4-year timeline. Total misappropriated funds, $13,847,200. The second page was a transaction log. Dates, amounts, account numbers. The column at the far right labeled Recipient Entity, with the names of the shell companies listed one by one below it. Hearthstone Construction Partners, Seabrook Development Solutions, Brightwater Capital Consulting. The third page was a wire transfer record. One transfer, $2.1 million, to an account in the Cayman Islands attached to a personal holding entity. The holding entity's listed director, Damian R. Reeves. The room was absolutely still. Reeves had turned. He was looking at the screen. His face had gone through something. Mason couldn't see it clearly from across the room, but the posture told enough. The posture of a man watching a structure he has spent years building become transparent all at once. He turned back to the microphone. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "This is being taken out of context." And then the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Agent Deming came in first, which Mason hadn't expected. He'd expected the agents who'd been in the room to move on Reeves, but Deming had positioned herself at the back entrance specifically for this, and she walked into the room with the particular quality of a federal agent who has done this before and is not in a hurry, which was somehow more alarming than haste would have been. The two agents who had been in the room moved toward the stage from opposite sides simultaneously. Reeves saw them. He took one step back from the podium. Then he stopped. The calculation happened fast. Mason could see it even from across the room. The rapid inventory of options, and the equally rapid recognition that the options were not what they'd been 20 minutes ago. He was on a stage in a room with 300 witnesses, 4 federal agents in his immediate field of view, and $13 million of forensic documentation on the screens behind him. He straightened. He put his hands in front of him, wrists together. It was not, Mason thought, what you'd call a dignified moment, but it had a kind of clarity to it. The clarity of a thing that has been complicated for a very long time becoming, at last, simple. Agent Deming reached the stage. "Damian Reeves," she said. She didn't raise her voice. The room was so quiet she didn't need to. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." She continued. Reeves stood and let her continue without interruption. His face arranged into something that was trying to be calm and landing somewhere closer to blank. The cuffs were on by the time she finished. The room had not recovered. 300 people were in various states of frozen. Some standing, some half standing, some still seated but turned entirely away from their tables. Near the front, Mason could see board members leaning toward each other. Near the side wall, a journalist he recognized from a local outlet had her phone out, and he'd have to think about that eventually, but not right now. He was watching Victoria. She was standing at the side of the stage, not on it, having stepped off when Reeves came up. She was watching the arrest with an expression that Mason couldn't fully categorize. Not triumphant, not relieved, not simply sad. Not something more complicated. The expression of someone watching a person they trusted for a long time be taken out of a room in handcuffs, and finding that the feeling it produces is not the feeling you anticipated. She looked tired. That was the thing underneath everything else. She looked like someone who had been awake since 2 a.m, finding terrible numbers, and then held it together for 15 more hours, and the adrenaline was starting to recede. Reeves was walked down from the stage and through the room. The agents made a path without making a spectacle of it. They moved directly, and the crowd parted, and there was no theater in it beyond the unavoidable theater of the thing itself. Reeves did not look at Mason as he passed, or if he did, Mason didn't catch it. He was looking at the exit. The room started generating sound again, the particular sound of 300 people processing something simultaneously, which was not a quiet sound. Mason moved through it toward the stage. Victoria saw him coming. She watched him cross the room, not with impatience, not with any particular readable expression, just with the steady attention of someone who has been waiting for a thing to arrive and is now watching it arrive. He stopped a few feet from her. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. I'm going to say yes and see how it holds up." "That's reasonable." "Is it?" She said it without edge, genuinely asking. "It's how most people manage the next hour after something like this," he said. She nodded slowly. Around them, the room was beginning to reorganize. Some people moving toward the exits, some staying, the board members making their way toward Victoria with the urgent collective motion of people who needed to do something and hadn't decided what yet. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Not for the first time, she'd asked this morning, and he'd given her an answer, and she was asking again, which meant the answer this morning hadn't been sufficient, which was fair. "Because the money wasn't supposed to be about me," he said, and because... He stopped, found the other part of it, the part he hadn't said this morning. "I wasn't sure I wanted to be known. Not here. Not in this life." She looked at him. "Why not?" He thought about Lily's drawing on the refrigerator, the boat with the cat flag, the version of his life that was real and small and specifically his, that he'd built out of a decision made in a hospital room when everything else was ash. "Because the life I have here is enough," he said. He shook his head slightly. "It took me a long time to build something that felt like enough. I didn't want to complicate it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The board members were 30 feet away and closing. "I need to go talk to them," she said. "I know. Mason." She said his name with a precision that suggested she'd been deciding whether to say what came next. "The things you funded, the Brunswick shelter, the programs in Valdosta, in Macon, in Charleston, all of it." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know I understand what that was, what it costs to give that way." She paused. I don't have words for it yet, but I wanted to say that. He nodded. He didn't have words for it either, which was partly why he'd spent 5 years doing it quietly instead. The board members arrived. Victoria turned to meet them, and the conversation that followed was the beginning of something long and complicated. Accountability, restructuring, legal exposure, press management, donor relations. The full weight of an organization's crisis descending at once. Mason watched her step into it, watched her straighten her spine slightly, not with performance, but with the physical adjustment of someone picking up something heavy and redistributing the load. She was good at it. He'd always understood that from the reports and the numbers. Seeing it up close was different. He stepped away, gave the conversation space. Pamela appeared at his elbow. She had her tablet in her hands and the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to be useful. "Mr. Drake," she said, "I've been asked to coordinate with your attorney regarding the documentation transfer and the communication to our major donors. Can I get contact information for Martin Cho?" "I'll text it to you," he said. She handed him her phone with her contact pulled up. He typed in Martin's number and handed it back. "The Brunswick project," he said. "The shelter. What's the status of the site?" Pamela blinked. "The construction's been halted for 8 months. The contractor who did the preliminary work, the real contractor, is still technically under contract, but the payment processing was frozen when we couldn't reconcile the account." She paused. "It's a concrete foundation and framing, structurally sound from what the site engineer said." 8 months behind, Mason said. "At least." He looked at the room. The chandeliers were still doing their work. The flowers were still extravagant. Someone had, at some point, turned off the screens displaying the audit documents, but not before every journalist in the room had photographed them. "Tell the contractor," Mason said, "that payment processing will resume by end of week. Tell them we want the project completed on the original timeline, plus whatever contingency they need for the delay." Pamela stared at him. Yes. Okay, I'll need it in writing from your attorney. Martin will send it tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "The families who were supposed to be in that building, is there a list? Names, current situations?" "There's a wait list," Pamela said carefully. 63 families. Most of them are in temporary housing. Some of them have been on the list for over a year. Mason nodded. 63 families. A year on a list, waiting for a building that existed as a concrete slab because someone had been clever about which numbers got looked at. "Make sure the site manager has everything they need," he said. "I'll be in touch with Martin about the funding." Pamela was writing in her tablet now. "Of course." She paused. "Mr. Drake, for what it's worth." She stopped. "You don't need to," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to anyway. What you did, the way you did it, it's saved this organization. And I know that's not why you did it, which is exactly the point." She looked up from the tablet. "So, thank you." He didn't say "you're welcome." He wasn't sure that fit. He said, "Just get that building finished." And she nodded and moved away with the focused efficiency of someone who finally had something concrete to do with their hands. The room was still churning around him. Guests in various states of departure and conversation, staff moving with the controlled urgency of people managing a crisis that was also, somehow, not the crisis they'd expected, because the ending that had just happened was not the ending anyone in the room had walked in anticipating. Mason finished his water. He looked toward the stage where Victoria was still in conversation with the board. 4 people, all talking, her in the center, managing the multiple directions of it with the focused patience of someone who understood that the next 20 minutes mattered as much as the next 20 months. She was gesturing slightly as she talked, making a point about something, and one of the board members was nodding, and another was writing something on his phone. She didn't look up. She was working. Mason picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd draped it earlier, said a brief word to the agent near the side exit, who looked at him with the neutral acknowledgement of someone who knows who you are and what you've done and is not going to make a production of it, and walked out of the ballroom. The elevator was empty. He rode it down to the lobby, walked through the marble and the warm lighting and the extravagant flowers at the entrance that had nothing to do with the Sterling Foundation and everything to do with the hotel's ongoing idea of itself, and went out into the Savannah night. It was cooler now. The city had done what it did in late spring evenings, released the heat gradually, the way it released everything, without urgency. He walked the 6 blocks to the truck. He was halfway there when his phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Tran. "Lily is asleep. She left a drawing on the table for you." He texted back, "Thank you. I'll be home soon." He kept walking. The live oaks overhead were doing their usual thing, holding their shapes in the dark, impervious, the Spanish moss moving slightly in the warm air coming off the river. A cat crossed the street in front of him. Not Mrs. Tran's cat, a different one, also orange, also clearly with somewhere to be. He thought, it's done. Then he thought, not quite. The building still needs to be finished. The donor communications need to go out. The forensic documentation needs to move through the regulatory process. Martin needs to file 3 things by Thursday. Tommy needs to be compensated properly for work he did for free because he believed in it. The work was done. The other work was just beginning. He got in the truck, sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel and the city quiet around him. He thought about Victoria at the podium, saying his name into a room full of people. He thought about the way she'd looked at him afterward, not with admiration, or not only with admiration, but with the specific quality of someone seeing something more completely than they had before, and finding that the fuller view was not simpler. He wasn't sure what that meant yet. He suspected he'd find out. He started the truck and drove home through the amber streets to the house where his daughter was sleeping and a drawing was waiting on the kitchen table. The drawing Lily had left on the kitchen table was of a ballroom. Mason stood over it for a moment, still in his suit jacket, the house quiet around him. She'd drawn it from imagination. She'd never been inside the DeSoto. But she'd gotten something right about it anyway. The chandeliers rendered as starburst circles, the tables as small ovals with dots around them for people. And at the front of the room, a figure in gray that was unmistakably supposed to be him. She'd given him a cape. He didn't know where the cape had come from. He chose not to examine it too carefully. At the bottom, in her uneven 8-year-old handwriting, "You were the hero, Dad." He stood there for longer than he meant to. Then he folded the drawing carefully and put it in the drawer where he kept the things he didn't want to lose. Lily's first school photo, a note from Claire he'd found in a jacket pocket 2 weeks after the funeral, the business card from his last day at Hargrove Capital that he'd never thrown away and never looked at directly. The drawer of things that were too heavy to display and too important to put anywhere else. He took off his jacket and tie and made himself a cup of tea he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. The city was settling into its late-night self outside. Distant traffic, the sound of something musical from a bar 3 streets over, the particular silence of a residential street at 11:30 that was never actually silence, just a lower register of ongoing life. Mason sat in it and let the evening decompress around him. The work was done. That was the thing he kept returning to, turning over like a stone to check what was underneath it. 4 years of careful architecture. The foundation, the disbursements, the quarterly reviews, the deliberate absence of his name from anything. And now it was done, in the sense that the structure had served its purpose and the anonymity had ended and Damian Reeves was somewhere in federal custody being processed. And the audit documentation was in the hands of people whose job it was to do the next thing with it. What surprised him was what it felt like. He'd expected relief, or something in the neighborhood of relief. What he felt was more like the specific emptiness that follows the completion of something you've been carrying for a long time. Not bad, not good, just the unfamiliar lightness of a particular weight being set down. He wasn't sure yet what to do with his hands without it. He thought about what Victoria had said at the stage. "I don't have words for it yet." He didn't either, which was fine. Words for things arrived on their own schedule, and forcing them early usually produced the wrong ones. He went to bed at midnight and slept better than he'd expected. The next 3 weeks arrived with the speed and density of weeks that are carrying a lot of business inside them. The story broke the morning after the gala in the Savannah Morning News, then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, then, and this was the part Mason had known was coming but had not entirely prepared for, the Associated Press. A boat mechanic on the Savannah waterfront, anonymous donor of $22 million, exposed a $13 million fraud at the organization he'd been funding for 5 years. The story had everything a story needed: money, deception, a dramatic public arrest, and the particular human element that made editors choose a headline over competing ones. The contrast between what a person appeared to be and what they actually were. His phone rang 40 times in the first 24 hours. He answered Martin's calls and Tommy's call and Mrs. Tran's call, in which she said, "I knew there was something different about you," with the satisfaction of a woman who had always trusted her instincts, and he did not answer the rest. He told Lily before she saw it somewhere else. He sat her down at the kitchen table on the Saturday morning after the gala, with her breakfast in front of her, and explained it in the clearest language he could find. That he'd had money from before they moved to Savannah. That he'd been giving it to organizations that helped kids and families who needed it. That the foundation was real, and he'd been running it quietly because he hadn't wanted people to treat him differently. Lily ate her eggs while he talked. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you know so much about boats?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "Because you had to learn something new when you stopped doing the money job." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's part of it." She considered this with the same seriousness she applied to math worksheets and strategic cats. "Are you going to stop fixing boats now?" she said. "No," he said. "Because of the reporters?" "Because I like fixing boats," he said. "The reporters will find something else to write about." She seemed satisfied with this. "Okay," she said. "Can I have more toast?" He made her more toast and thought that whatever he'd done right in the last 4 years, the fact of Lily, the specific person she was becoming, her particular way of locating the practical question inside the emotional event, was the part he was most sure of. Ray, at the marina, said 3 words when Mason came in the Monday after the story ran. He was standing at the end of the dock with his coffee, looking at the water, and he turned when he heard Mason's footsteps. "Figured it was something," Ray said. "You figured what was something?" "You." Ray turned back to the water. "Too careful, too patient. Nobody's that patient with a diesel injector unless they've been patient with something harder." He drank his coffee. "Boat's ready at slip 9, the Marlene. Rudder's giving trouble again." Mason picked up his tools. "Ray," he said. "Yeah." "Thanks for not asking." Ray looked at him sideways. "You were fixing the boats fine," he said. "Didn't need your whole life story to know that." Mason went to work on the Marlene. The federal case moved with the particular momentum of federal cases. Slower than a news cycle, faster than most people expected when they hadn't been through one. The indictment came down on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the arrest. 14 counts: wire fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, and 2 counts of filing false organizational reports with the state. Reeves's attorney, a man from Atlanta whose firm specialized in white-collar defense, made the standard noises about context and complexity and the presumption of innocence. The court set a trial date for the following spring. The civil recovery process was more immediate. Martin worked with the FBI's Asset Recovery Unit and the organization's legal team to trace and freeze Reeves's known accounts, including the Cayman holding entity. The Cayman transfer, the $2.1 million wire that had been the second mistake, the one that broke Reeves's own careful pattern, was frozen within 72 hours of the indictment. The domestic assets recovered in the first month totaled just under $8 million. $8 million of the 13.8. The remaining 5.8 was the harder question. Some of it had moved through the shell companies into accounts that were now untraceable, or traceable only at the end of a long investigative process that would outlast the news cycle by years. Martin was honest with Mason about this. "You may never get all of it back," he said. "That's the nature of this kind of fraud. The structure is designed specifically so that the last layer is difficult to reach." "I know," Mason said. "The $8 million plus what the organization can fundraise in the recovery period, it should be enough to complete the priority construction projects. Brunswick, the Macon expansion, the Transitional Housing Initiative in Charleston." "What's the timeline on Brunswick?" "Contractor says 16 weeks from restart, assuming weather cooperates. Call it 18 to be safe." Mason did the math. 18 weeks was late fall. The 63 families on the wait list had been waiting over a year already. 18 more weeks was not nothing. "Tell them to hire whatever additional crew they need to compress the timeline," Mason said. "I'll authorize the cost overage." Martin paused. That'll be significant. The labor, tell them, Mason said. Martin told them. The contractor, a man named Gerald Hatch, who had done the preliminary framing and then sat on a halted project for 8 months without understanding why, called Mason directly to confirm. He had the voice of a man who built things and found the inactivity of the halt deeply offensive on a professional level. 12 weeks, Gerald said. If I can bring in 2 additional crews and push the interior finish schedule, I can do 12. 12 weeks, Mason said. Do it. The phone call with Gerald lasted 6 minutes and contained more emotional weight, on both ends, than either of them acknowledged directly, which was exactly how Mason preferred it. Tommy Brewer quit his job at the accounting firm 5 weeks after the gala. Mason heard about it from Tommy directly, over the phone, on a Thursday evening. There was a quality to Tommy's voice that Mason recognized as someone who had been working up to saying something for a while and had finally decided to say it. I've been offered a position, Tommy said, with a nonprofit financial oversight organization. They do forensic reviews of charitable organizations, identify systemic vulnerabilities, help boards set up better internal controls. They saw the coverage of the Sterling case and reached out. A pause. It pays about 60% of what I was making. Are you going to take it? I already took it, Tommy said. I'm telling you because... He stopped. Started again. I wanted you to know that what we did, the 2 weeks at your kitchen table, the spreadsheets, all of it, it's the most useful thing I've done professionally, and I wanted to say that without it being weird. It's not weird, Mason said. Good. Another pause. Also, I think you should know, the forensic auditor I worked with, Dr. Reyes, she's writing up the methodology we used as a case study for professional training purposes, with names changed. I told her that was fine from my end. I didn't know if... That's fine, Mason said. If it helps someone catch the next one faster, do it. Okay. Tommy's voice settled into something quieter. How are you doing? With the... all of it. Mason thought about the question honestly. I'm all right, he said. It's a lot of noise right now. It'll quiet down. The press stuff? The press stuff, the calls, people treating me differently. He paused. A woman at the school pickup lane told me I was an inspiration last week. I didn't know what to do with that. What did you do? I said thank you and went to find Lily. Tommy made a sound that was close to a laugh. That tracks, he said. Mason, for whatever it's worth, I don't think you're an inspiration. I think you're just someone who paid attention to what mattered. Most people don't. You did. That's a smaller and more accurate thing than inspiration. Mason sat with that for a moment. I'll take the smaller and more accurate thing, he said. Yeah, Tommy said. I thought you would. Victoria called him for the first time on her own terms. Not about the investigation, not about the legal process, not about the donor communications. On a Sunday morning, 5 weeks after the gala. Mason was on the dock, not working, just sitting with coffee in the early light, which was something he did some Sunday mornings when Lily slept in and the marina was quiet and the world hadn't started demanding things of anyone yet. Are you busy? She said. No. Can I ask you something that isn't about the foundation? He looked at the water. The light was doing its early morning thing, low and amber, making the river look briefly like it was made of something other than water. Yes, he said. Why boats? She said. You could have done anything. When you left New York, you could have started a different company, or consulted, or gone into something adjacent to what you'd been doing. Why boats? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you can't do anything else while you're doing it, he said. When you're inside an engine, the engine is the only thing. The problem is physical. The solution is physical. You can't think about anything else and do it well. You needed something that required your whole attention. I needed something that required my hands, he said. The attention followed. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that. The hands part. Another pause. I've spent 15 years doing work that mostly happens on paper. Budgets and proposals and reports and presentations. I believe in it. I do. But sometimes I think I've forgotten what it feels like to build something you can touch. You were painting walls at your own shelter, he said. I read that somewhere. A slight pause that might have been surprise. That was 3 years ago. How did I do due diligence on organizations before the foundation makes significant grants, he said. Your profile came across my desk. Someone mentioned the wall painting. What did you think when you read that? He considered. I thought it was probably a good sign. She made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sound of exasperation. That's a very accountant way to describe someone painting walls. I'm not an accountant, he said. I'm a boat mechanic. You're also a man who spent 5 years running a $22 million charitable foundation. Quietly, he said. Quietly, she agreed. And then, after a pause, I want to come see the Brunswick site when they break ground. Restart the construction, I mean. When they officially restart. Is that something you'd be at? He hadn't been planning to be. He'd been planning to fund it from a distance the way he'd funded everything else, and let the work speak. But something in the question made him reconsider. Or maybe it wasn't the question. Maybe it was the specific way she'd asked it, the slight uncertainty in it that she hadn't tried to conceal. I can be there, he said. Okay, she said. Good. Another pause. Not uncomfortable, just the pause of a conversation finding its edges. Victoria, he said. Yes. How are you actually doing? She took a moment with it, which he'd come to recognize as the thing she did when she was deciding how honest to be. Some days are better than others, she said. The board restructuring it's necessary and it's exhausting, and it involves a lot of conversations with people who all have different ideas about what oversight should look like from here. A pause. I had dinner with Pamela last week and cried in the parking lot afterward for about 10 minutes, which I haven't done in a long time. Parking lots are useful for that, he said. They are, she said, and there was something in her voice, something that had been careful and composed relaxing slightly, the way things relax when they're allowed to be what they are. Lily's doing okay? The shift surprised him. She's good. She's trying to teach the neighbor's cat to respond to its name. It's not going well, but she's not giving up. Victoria laughed. It was a real laugh, not a social one, quick and unguarded. That sounds exactly right, she said. The Brunswick groundbreaking, technically the re-groundbreaking, the restart, the resumption of something that should never have stopped, happened on a Thursday morning in late October, 11 weeks after Gerald Hatch had promised 12. Gerald had done it in 11. Mason had not been surprised. The site was at the edge of a residential street in Brunswick, Georgia, where the concrete foundation had been sitting for 8 months under Georgia weather and a blue tarp that had seen better days. Gerald's crew had pulled the tarp, assessed the foundation, sound, as the site engineer had said, and begun framing within the first week of restart. By the time the official ceremony happened, the structure was already 2 floors up and the exterior walls were going on, which meant the ceremony was less about breaking ground and more about acknowledging what was already happening, which Mason thought was the more honest version of a groundbreaking anyway. He drove down from Savannah with Lily, who had asked to come and who had not asked why in the particular way she had of not asking things she sensed required a longer answer than a car ride could contain. She wore her good jacket and brought a book for the drive and fell asleep 30 minutes outside of Savannah and woke up exactly as they pulled into Brunswick, which was a gift. Victoria was already there when they arrived. She was standing near the fence line with Pamela and a woman Mason recognized as Carolyn, the director of the Brunswick Shelter Program, the woman who had run the temporary operation for years and was now going to have a permanent building. Carolyn was in her 60s, small and precise, with the bearing of someone who had been asking for this building for a long time and had developed a very specific relationship with patients. Victoria saw Mason's truck pull in and walked over. Lily got out of the passenger side and looked at the half-built structure with the appraising eye of someone taking inventory. It's big, she said. It's going to be bigger, Mason said. How many people will live here? Families, he said. About 60. Maybe more later. Lily looked at the building for another moment. Then she looked at Victoria, who had arrived within earshot. Hi, Lily said. Hi, Victoria said. I like your jacket. Thank you. My dad got it. Lily glanced at Mason. He has okay taste sometimes. Mason said nothing. Victoria looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard not to be a smile and losing the effort. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Gerald's ahead of schedule." "I know. He called me." "He calls you directly?" "We've developed a rapport," Mason said. The ceremony was brief and practical, the way ceremonies should be when the actual work is already underway. Carolyn spoke for 7 minutes about the families on the wait list and about what a permanent building meant for the continuity of the program and about the specific ways that stability changed outcomes for children. And she said this last part with the authority of someone who had tracked those outcomes for 20 years and no longer needed statistics to make the point. The numbers were in her posture, her vocabulary, the specific way she talked about the children in her program as individuals rather than data. Mason stood near the back of the small gathered crowd, staff, board members, a few local officials, 2 journalists, and listened. Lily stood beside him, her book tucked under her arm, listening with the attentiveness she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting. When Carolyn finished, there was the kind of applause that happens when a room of people are genuinely moved, and the applause is just the overflow of it. Mason clapped with everyone else and felt, somewhere in the middle of his chest, the particular sensation of a thing clicking into place, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just the quiet satisfaction of a structure finally being honest about its purpose. After the official part, people dispersed across the site. Gerald gave a small group a tour of the framing, pointing out structural details with the enthusiasm of a man whose work had been paused for 8 months, and who had things to say about it. Pamela organized the board members near the site office. Carolyn was immediately surrounded by her staff, who had questions. Mason found himself at the edge of the site with Victoria, looking at the building. Lily had drifted toward Gerald's tour group, where she was asking him something that appeared to require a lengthy answer because Gerald had stopped moving and was using his hands. "She has questions," Victoria said. "She always has questions," Mason said. They stood for a moment in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it, and are figuring out what that means. "The Cayman recovery," Victoria said. "Martin told me the legal process could take up to 2 years. That's the realistic estimate. And the remaining $5 million that moved through the shell accounts may not be fully recoverable," Mason said. "I know." "The foundation?" She stopped, started again. "Mason, I need to ask you something directly. The Drake Foundation's ongoing support, after everything that's happened and the exposure and the legal process, are you planning to continue the funding relationship with our organization?" He looked at the building, the framing going up, level by level. Gerald's crew moving with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what they were building and why it mattered. "Yes," he said, "with a few changes." She looked at him. "What changes?" "More direct involvement," he said. "Not hands-in-the-budget involvement, but I want site visits. I want to meet the program directors. I want the foundation's support to be something we both understand the shape of, rather than something I manage from a distance through quarterly reports." He paused. The anonymity worked for what it was. I'm not sure it's the right structure going forward. Because Reeves happened. Partly, and partly because he stopped, found the honest version of it. Because I've been managing this from behind a wall for 4 years. And I'm not sure the wall was only about protecting the programs. She looked at him steadily. What else was it about? He thought about the hospital room, about the version of himself he'd walked away from. About a 2-bedroom rental on the waterfront and a truck with a busted speaker and a life he'd built specifically to contain certain things and exclude certain others. I think I was protecting myself, he said, from being known. From being, he shook his head slightly, from the version of life where people know what you have and start to want things from you. And now? He looked at Lily, who had apparently satisfied Gerald's capacity for questions and was now walking toward them through the site with her book under her arm and a look of someone who had gathered information and was processing it. Now I think I've been quiet long enough, he said. Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. She was looking at the building, at the walls going up, at the workers moving across the site with purpose, at the physical evidence of something that had been promised and stalled and was now, finally, becoming real. I owe you an apology, she said, not just for the gala, for the whole pattern of it, You were funding our work for 5 years, and I had no idea who you were. And when we finally ended up in the same room, I let one of my staff humiliate you and walked away." She said it flatly, the self-justification fully gone. "That's on me." "You didn't know." "No, but I didn't look either." She turned to face him. "I make a lot of decisions about resource allocation and program structure and organizational strategy. I'm good at that. What I'm not always good at is the people right in front of me, the ones who don't announce themselves." A pause. "I'm working on that." He looked at her. The morning light was doing something particular to the site, cutting across at an angle, making the new framing throw shadows on the concrete that showed the building's shape even before the building had fully arrived at it. "I'm not easy to know," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm private and I don't explain myself well, and I have a daughter who is everything to me, and that's not going to change." "I know," she said. "And I fix boats. That's a real job. It's not a disguise." "I know that too." "Okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "I'm saying, given all of that, I think this—" He gestured slightly, a gesture that was meant to include the building and the morning and the conversation and the thing that had been developing between them since a ballroom and a sidewalk and a phone call at 2:17 in the morning. "I think this is worth figuring out." She held his gaze. "So do I," she said. Lily arrived between them and looked at the building and said, "The man Gerald says they'll be done in 3 weeks. He's very serious about the schedule." "He is," Mason agreed. "He said 60 families," Lily said. "Is that 60 kids?" "Some families have kids, some don't," Mason said. Lily considered this. "They should have a garden," she said. "Buildings with gardens are better. I read that." Victoria looked at Lily. "You're right," she said. "We've actually been talking about adding a community garden space. The landscape plan isn't finalized yet." Lily turned to her with focused attention. "I could draw some ideas," she said. "I'm good at drawing." "I know you are," Victoria said. Lily looked satisfied. She opened her book and found her page and began reading, standing between them, apparently having decided that the conversation was adequately resolved and she could attend to other things now. Mason looked at Victoria over the top of Lily's head. Victoria looked back. Neither of them said anything. The building went up around them in the good noise of work being done, the sound of things being built that should have been built a long time ago and were being built now, and that was the nature of most things worth building. They arrived later than they should and mattered more because of it. The Brunswick shelter opened on a Friday in January, 12 weeks after the restart. Gerald Hatch was there. Tommy Brewer was there, having driven from Atlanta, where he'd moved for his new position. Martin Cho was there, which surprised Mason, because Martin had said he'd try to make it, but Martin always said he'd try to make it. Carolyn was there, wearing a jacket Mason had never seen her wear before, standing at the entrance of the building she'd been asking for since before the waitlist existed. The first 6 families moved in that weekend. Mason and Lily were there on the Saturday when the families arrived. Not in any official capacity, no speeches, no ceremony, just the practical fact of a building receiving people. Mason carried boxes because there were boxes that needed carrying, and Lily helped a woman named Mrs. Delacroix arrange furniture in a second-floor apartment because Mrs. Delacroix's son was 7 and distracted, and Lily managed him with the patient authority of an experienced older sibling, which she was not, but apparently the instinct was present anyway. Victoria arrived at noon and immediately started doing things. This was, Mason had come to understand, her default mode in any space that required something. She assessed and acted without making a production of either. She helped a family on the 3rd floor assemble a bed frame that came with instructions clearly designed by someone who had never assembled a bed frame. And Mason heard her swear once, quietly, in the hallway, and then hear Lily's voice saying, "I can hear you," from 2 rooms away, and then Victoria's voice saying sorry to nobody in particular. He smiled at that, alone in the stairwell, carrying a box. Late in the afternoon, when most of the moving was done and the building had settled into its new hum of occupied life, Mason found himself on the building's small back terrace, looking at the lot that Carolyn had already flagged for the garden. It was just cleared ground right now. Georgia clay, pale and unpromising, but there. Victoria found him there. She stood beside him, looking at the same unpromising rectangle of ground. Garden committee meets next week, she said. Lily is apparently already designing something. She showed me last night, he said. It involved a significant number of tomatoes. She has a vision. She has her mother's certainty, he said. It came out before he'd decided to say it, and he let it stand because it was true, and true things tended to stand up under their own weight. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of not knowing what to say. The quiet of recognizing that something had been offered and it deserved space. What was she like? Victoria said. He thought about it. Practical, he said. More practical than I was. She could tell when I was getting tangled up in something, and she'd just say, "What's the actual problem?" And usually the actual problem was simpler than I'd made it. He paused. She would have found all of this. He gestured. The building, the situation, the entire year. She would have found it interesting. She would have had questions about the shell company structure that were somehow both very basic and cutting straight to the problem. She sounds like someone I'd have liked, Victoria said. Yeah, he said. I think so. The back door opened and Lily appeared, still holding the notebook she'd been using to record garden ideas, with a smear of something on her jacket that Mason hoped was just marker. The kid on the third floor wants to know if there are going to be swings, she said. In the garden? Victoria said. He's 7, Lily said, with the pragmatism of someone who understood that 7-year-olds had their own set of priorities. He wants swings. Victoria looked at Mason. Mason looked at Victoria. Tell him we're looking into it, Victoria said. Lily considered this answer. That means probably yes? That means we're looking into it, Victoria said. Lily looked at her notebook, wrote something, and went back inside. Mason and Victoria stood on the terrace in the January air, which was cool but not cold, the way January in coastal Georgia was cool but not cold. The clay ground in front of them would, in a few months, be something else, turned and amended and planted with whatever Lily and Carolyn and whoever else joined the garden committee decided it should be. The building behind them was full of people doing the ordinary things that people do when they move into a new home, arranging, adjusting, opening boxes, trying to figure out where everything goes. The ordinary things, which were, Mason had come to understand, the extraordinary things, the things that all the money and all the work and all the documents and the careful structures and the late nights at kitchen tables were actually in service of. Not the structure, the life inside the structure. He'd known this, in an abstract way when he started the foundation. He knew it differently now, more specifically, with the particular weight of having stood in a stairwell of a finished building carrying a box, hearing a family arrange their furniture on the other side of a wall. Mason, Victoria said. Yeah. Thank you for not making me ask for it, or earn it, or justify it. The money, the work, the 5 years. She paused. You just did it, because it needed doing. He looked at the ground, then at the building, then at her. It wasn't entirely selfless, he said. She looked at him. No? It kept me from doing something worse, he said, with the time, with the money, with all of it. He paused. I needed somewhere to put what I had. The foundation gave me that. And now? He thought about what now looked like. The dock in the morning, the particular quality of early light on water, Lily's drawings on the refrigerator accumulating, a gray suit that fit better at the end of the year than it had at the beginning, because he'd worn it enough times that it had adjusted. Martin's calls, Tommy's new job, Gerald Hatch's careful scheduling. Victoria standing beside him in January light outside a building that now existed and hadn't before. Now the next project, he said, the Macon expansion, the Charleston transitional housing. There's a program in Augusta that came across Martin's desk last month that's worth looking at. He paused. And Lily has opinions about swings. Victoria made a sound that was entirely a laugh this time. She does, she said. So, yeah. He looked at her. Now the next thing. She looked at him for a long moment. He'd come to understand over the months since the gala that Victoria Sterling's silences meant different things. Some of them were tactical, the pause of someone deciding how to frame a position. Some of them were processing, the pause of someone integrating information. And some of them were this, The pause of someone who is simply present in a moment and not trying to do anything with it. This was the last kind. He'd come to appreciate that most. The back door opened again. Lily again, still with the notebook. Mrs. Delacroix says dinner's at 5 and we're all invited, Lily said. She's making something. A pause. She said it's Haitian and it smells incredible. Victoria looked at Mason. Mason looked at Victoria. Tell her we'll be there, Mason said. Lily nodded with the satisfaction of a mission completed and went back inside, letting the door close behind her. The terrace was quiet for a moment. The clay ground, the building, the January light doing its low-level thing across everything, making even the unpromising dirt look like it contained something. There's a version of this story that ends with a grand declaration. Love announced, futures promised, the curtain down on a life reorganized around certainty. That's not this story. This story ends with two people standing on a concrete terrace outside a building that took too long and was too hard and mattered enormously, about to walk inside to eat dinner with a family they barely knew in a home that hadn't existed 6 months ago. It ends with the ordinary things, which are the extraordinary things. What Mason had learned, and he'd learned it the hard way, which is the only way it actually stays learned, was that the biggest lie people tell themselves about life is that the important moments are the dramatic ones. The arrest in the ballroom, the name spoken from the stage, the number on the screen, those moments matter, but they don't last. They pass through the room and leave, and the room goes back to being a room. What lasts is this: a daughter who draws cat flags and asks the practical question. A building that now has people in it. A woman who paints walls at her own shelter and swears at furniture assembly instructions and asks good questions and stands beside you in January without needing to fill the quiet. The work. The daily, imperfect, ongoing work of paying attention to what's in front of you and doing something about it. He'd left a life that looked significant from the outside and felt hollow from the inside. He'd built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and turned out to be, in every way that mattered, exactly enough. And now, with the foundation going forward with its name attached, with the next project and the one after it, with Lily's garden designs and a new beginning that didn't announce itself as one, it was becoming something more than enough. It was becoming, in the slow and specific way of real things, a future. He held the door open for Victoria. She walked through and he followed, and inside the building was the smell of Haitian food and the sound of a family in a new home, and Lily's voice explaining something important to a 7-year-old about the strategic value of tomatoes. And it was exactly, perfectly, imperfectly enough.